So I am very privileged and extremely pleased to have this very distinguished members of the panel up here at this very timely moment, as many have mentioned. Foreign Minister Wang Yi was here in Europe last week, and we have the EU-China summit coming up at the end of this month. Also, the second Trump administration is still waging the tariff negotiations, a deadline for which has been extended to August 1st. And so talk about a really timely moment, a critical moment, in fact, for Europe. So I and my team from the Center for China Analysis has been going through Europe to Brussels and then now in Paris, going to different meetings with members of the policymaking community, trying to understand Europe's point of view as to how it's viewing China, how it's viewing US-China relationship, and also its own position between these two powers, especially on the economic sphere. And I was really struck by a remark that a commentator made during one of these private meetings, which is that he said the economic interdependence between Germany and Great Britain prior to World War I actually created a lot of potential for conflict, for tension, and led to conflagration. And during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, it was a lack of these interdependencies, these connections that led to sort of a tamping down, perhaps, a minimization of some of the conflicts that could have occurred. Of course, there was a danger of nuclear war, there were proxy wars, and a lot of tensions at that time. So to me, this seemed like a turning around on its head, something that I used to hear 10, 20 years ago, which is that between US and China, it was actually these connections that provided the stability, the ballast, the anchoring between the two powers, especially as China was rising in its economic might and in its geopolitical ambition. But now I was hearing that separate houses is better instead of an overarching roof under two rivals or competing powers. So to explore this idea further, I have before me, again, these four very distinguished members of this panel to help us understand between the power rivalry between the US and China, where does Europe land? Can it actually maneuver an independent path between US and China economic and geopolitical rivalry, and whether that strategic autonomy can be carved out for Europe for it to sustain its industry and also to become actually a thriving economic power beyond the rivalry. So again, I'm very privileged to have these four members here, and I just want to dive into some of the questions that actually this panel starts off with, is whether an economic grand bargain between China and the EU is possible. So, Alicia, could I start with you? So at this moment, at this very critical moment, you have written rather extensively that this is not the time for Europe to actually embrace China full-heartedly, and actually reviving the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, CAI, is not a good move. And to reduce the tariff on Chinese imports in EV is actually not a good idea. So could you give us your rationale as to why that might be true?
Okay, first of all, thank you for, can you hear me? Yeah, this is on. Good. No, it's not on. So it will be on if I push the button. There you go. So first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Since, I got directly into my point of view on this great bargain, let me start by saying that a great bargain, the fact that I do not support a great bargain doesn't mean that I support full decoupling or even massive de-risking or anything like that. I actually think China and Europe must coexist and continue to trade and invest. But the question is not whether we should continue to do that. The question is whether we should embark in a great bargain. So what is a great bargain? To be very frank, CAI, this is famous agreement signed nothing less but the 30th of December of 2020, just to tell you the amount of pressure for anybody living in Europe. You know, the Commission doesn't sign anything on the 30th of December, any December, let alone 2020. So there's this huge pressure, because that was a deadline that both sides had imposed, and Xi Jinping had actually even, you know, basically personally supported. And I think the whole idea is this had to be signed. So the deal isn't really, to start, a very good deal. It's massively focused on investment, not trade. So to start, it's not the right deal. But imagine we work on a new deal. Yeah? So why do I argue that maybe not the right time? Well, first, because we are on a losing side with China now, we Europeans, in three ways. The first one is that our exports to China, most people focus on our 400 billion trade deficit. That's not the point. The point is we're not exporting to China for two reasons. China is not importing from anybody. Imports are flat. But it is worse than that. Our market share in China, i.e. European imports into China, is falling from 12.5 to barely 10. So out of a flat market, we're losing market share. So who's going to change that a deal? Many countries have deals with China. We're one of the few who doesn't have a free trade agreement with China. But not everybody who has, I give you the example of Switzerland, is gaining market share either. So why not? Because what we produce competes directly with China now, in the European market, in the Chinese market, in third markets. So the point is not the deal, it's how do we deal with this competition. Second point is our companies. Actually, we'll have a publication at Bruegel coming out right now on the sentiment, why European companies are unhappy in China. Let me tell you that if you thought 2022, zero COVID, somebody from Shanghai mentioned, was the worst year, no, the worst year was 2025, this year. So it's going like this, falling like a rock. That's European companies in China. Why? Are they asking for a deal? No. They're asking for reciprocity. They're asking for less competition. You may say, wow. Yeah, because there's over-competition. It's not about not having competition plus unequal footing. So our companies are not asking for the deal. That's why I'm saying, okay, we need to think of something else, because that's not what's going to solve the problem. And finally, on EVs, why not lift the tariffs? This is very tactical and very simple. Very simple. Some countries in Europe want to receive investment from from China. Fine. Why would China produce in Europe if Chinese autos, we'll hear more about it, are so efficient? Or battery companies. Why? Only because there are tariffs. That's the only reason why they would come to Europe, because the cost of production in Europe is higher. Actually, our tariffs are too low, if that's the objective. So, you know, point is, if you lift them, many of the projects that are still, you know, in the air won't happen, because it's so much better for a country with overcapacity just export their way out with a bigger margin than produce in Europe. So that's the reason.
Got it. So we've heard many reasons as to why sectorally and sort of in terms of the market, it doesn't make, firms are actually not asking for a deal at this point. So Ted, from your perspective, from the US perspective, the transatlantic point of view, what is your point of view in terms of whether a grand or even a small deal is possible between the EU and China at this point?
Well, first, it's just great to be here, and thank you for, thank the Asia Society for convening this group. I knew that if Duncan threw a party, it would be oversubscribed, so I'm not surprised it's standing room here. I should start also saying I worked in the last administration in Washington, and I'm now at a government affairs and sort of geopolitical risk firm, and I didn't expect as I made that career transition that as much of the geopolitical risk that we would be considering would be emanating from Washington. So I speak, as you asked for the American perspective, I speak with some humility, offering the American perspective that we are one of the risk factors that you are all seeking to manage. I'd also say on the panel, it's more fun if we disagreed. I agree with much of what you said. When I was in government and was meeting with European Commission and member state counterparts, I felt that the appreciation of the economic challenge, the appreciation of the security challenge that China faced was quite similar. We often disagreed on tactics, and we would squabble at length on exactly how we would respond, or would we respond within the WTO, or would we respond outside the WTO, or specific policy proposals we would pursue, and that reflected different interests that we had and different approaches that we had, but I think the appreciation of the challenge was quite similar. And I think that the challenge now is more stark, in part because of policies from Washington and the US economy being more closed to exports from China. The reality is, over the last number of months, exports from China to the EU have now grown. So as the US closes, Europe is more exposed to that overcapacity and more challenged by that overcapacity. And I think that China, in the midst of, you used the word in your introduction, waging negotiation from Washington. Usually it's waging war, so I thought it was an interesting turn of phrase and perhaps apt for the approach that the current administration is taking in Washington. But because of that approach, I think China, that was already building a more self-sufficient economy, is just accelerating and doing that process more, and not only with respect to the United States, but also with respect to other trading partners, which narrows the opportunity for Europe as well. And so I was just coming from Brussels. Certainly the meetings I had at the European Commission, I think the expectations for the EU-China summit are quite low. And I think, agree with the previous speaker, that it's not likely or desirable that there will be some grand bargain. Now, I want to end on two sort of more positive things. The first is, that doesn't mean there won't be commercial opportunity. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be investment between the two countries. I think a failure in US policy, or in the imagination of US policy now, is not to think through more effectively how we could have Chinese investment in the United States. And likewise, I think there will be Chinese investment in the EU. And though it should go through an investment screening process, or may require certain protections to make sure everyone's comfortable with that, that's something that should happen and can be in the economic interests of Europe, and people should be leaning into that process and those commercial opportunities. And the other thing I would say is, you don't need a grand bargain to try to have a productive relationship. There's to sort of frame the national security types that I spend some time with in Washington. There's a strain of thought in Washington that it's a loss by the EU that they are traveling to China to have the summit, and that if it was reciprocal visits, it would be China's turn to come to Europe, and so that is already a failure of European policy. I think that's ridiculous. I think that it takes energy and time to manage the relationship, and if this is the way to have the meeting in China. And so good that the EU is making that investment in the relationship. I think the Trump administration, candidly, for all the critique, and this isn't a panel about the Trump administration, thank God, but for all the critique of really baseline failure, is just not actually investing in the relationship, because there is an effort needed to maintain a relationship and make sure that it doesn't go off the rails. So in answer to your sort of largest question, no, I don't think it's likely or desirable, but it doesn't mean that there's not scope for much work within the relationship between the EU and China, and we can dive into that in more detail.
Great. So we've heard lots of strands of thoughts here regarding the reluctance and the relationship at the grand level, but also some hesitation and some, difficulty in the relationship at the firm level. And so I did want to dive down a little bit too, and turn to you, Dr. Ding, regarding, so Chinese firms, multinational, state-owned, private, are facing these de-risking kinds of pressures from Western firms. What are some tactics and strategies that they're using? in order to sustain itself and sort of invest outwards? And also, what are the things that they're doing tactically? And also, are these permanent structural changes, or are these temporary hedges?
Yeah, thank you very much for offering this opportunity to speak. Thanks, Duncan and the team. And yes, I try to bring you some firm-level observations. So I'm in a very privileged post because CEIBS, my school, is organizing the biggest executive education in the world. So we have like 14 classes of 60 executives going through our classroom every year. So I teach all of them. And of course, it's from every industry. And you can imagine that since 2014, the SOEs, they cut their link with EMBA. So this is the missing piece from the classroom, but still you have a lot of former student alumni that you can get contact. So as Jennifer mentioned very well, these three groups, and they are facing very different challenges. If you talk about SOEs, there's clearly a clear direction of politicalization of the business in the SOEs. So every decision it become extremely high risk for the executive's career. So they are very risk averse. That's from the internal side, and with so many continuous anti-corruption campaigns. So people are becoming less and less audacious. That's very clear. But the space, if we talk about interface with the world, the space for them to operate outside China is extremely limited. And now the SOEs, as in China, they are more on the upstream, as you know, in the natural resources, infrastructure, and finance industries mainly, right? So if they go outside, they can only work with one belt, one road strategies, basically some of them are working in Africa, in Southeast Asia, Latin America, period. So it's very difficult for them to go to so-called the developed world. So the door is shut down clearly, both for operation, investment, and for financing, because U.S. just kicked them out for the listing in U.S., right? So it's very clear. And for the multinationals in China, the situation is also very, very difficult. And like Alicia mentioned, first, they don't have the privileged treatment before. I think in the past, they treated like the upper citizen in China with all the tax cut, the red carpet, but now it's almost over. And also the competition from the local players is very, very tough. And they're losing the touch with the consumers. And also the real issue is that they are raising suspicions from their headquarters because of operation in China used to be profitable, growing, and politically correct, because engaging with China was politically correct. Now engaging with China raised suspicions. Even Volkswagen is facing some hearings in Germany about their Xinjiang operation, which is ridiculous, right? So it's coming, right? So they feel got caught in the middle, squeezed in the Chinese side by the competition, by the less favorable treatment by the local government because of their intention, but mainly because of the means available, because without the land proceed revenues, they cannot deliver the promise they made with a lot of subsidies for the foreign companies. On the Chinese company side, and we cite many of these champions, and I had the luxury to get very close to them. I was in Yingde with Caltel very recently in May. I was also in Shunde with Maidi, who bought Kuka. So I was with the biggest ring energy and solar energy company based in Hefei, called the Sun Power, the Yangguang Dianyuan. So they are the largest in the world, and they are operating, of course, everywhere. Some of them except in U.S. But the problem they are facing, of course, they are all so-called private companies without state-owned shares, and they caught in the middle. I think in the, this morning, Dan made a very good comment about thanks to or despite of, but they are having both, right? Now currently, clearly, like Alicia said, they all have the intention to set up a business in Europe, not because of the economic rationale, but as they know very well that the smooth supply chain, globalized supply chain, high efficiency is over. Now they have to go nearshoring in order to gain the trust and to run business in Europe. They understand that very well. So that's why they are coming to Hungary, to Spain, and some of them go to Turkey. But the real issue for them is that they caught in the middle. They got caught in the middle. On one side here, we are pushing them to bring the latest technology to Europe as a requirement. I fully understand the rationale, like the Chinese did with Volkswagen in the past, right? However, they got caught in the middle because the Chinese authorities require them not go with the last generation. And for them, they are poor business people. They just want to earn money to expand their business. So they caught in the middle. So I just stop here. Thank you.
Great. Great summary of the different challenges that different kinds of firms are facing right now. And I'm going to come back to you actually for you to speak more about the MNCs. So, Harald, we want to focus on the auto sector. You have such deep expertise in that, and I know that the influx of EVs from China is really making the industrial sector, the auto sector in Europe, very nervous. And so I want to ask you, how is it that Europe kind of fell behind in the auto sector, in the EV sector? Was it sort of smart industrial policy making in China, or was it that there was something that Europe failed to do in time?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here. It's an honor to speak with your society and with all the guests, and so thank you for having me. So look, I mean, a few thoughts as I was thinking, and specifically with the headline of the panel we're doing. We're in a grand bargain. We've been in a grand bargain with China for 50 years, right? And if you think about it specifically from the perspective of the automotive industry, right, we gave them technology, we gave them factories, and then they allowed us to make enormous profits in China. Right, and that's been the way that's been for a very, very long time, and that's obviously worked very well during that time. The question is whether that works well today and whether that needs a reset or not, right? And so I'll make a few points about that. I tend to be in agreement. Generally speaking, free trade, I think we should all be always in favor of free trade. But we do need to think about how we define free trade, whether it really is free trade, and if one side is really clearly not doing very well in that free trade, then how do you reset the situation, right? And so in this particular situation, I actually agree with the previous speakers that tariffs, at least for Europe, to protect the European employment and the European automotive industry are necessary for many reasons, not necessarily just the subsidies, to be honest. So very important just in terms of the Chinese market. The Chinese market, automotive market, has changed completely, basically through COVID. So the history of the Chinese market was that locals had 30 or 40% market share, higher market share in the inland areas and the cheaper cars, say sub $10,000 cars. The bigger cities were dominated more by the global OEMs that had joint ventures. They were forced to have joint venture with the local SOEs, right? And that basically built the whole of the Chinese car industry up until about 2016-17. And I think the really, really big change that's happened since then is that, Europe legislated for CO2 on what I would view to be a very dogmatic view of the world and heavily based on regulation, which has increased costs in Europe across all industries and specifically the automotive industry to huge degrees, to the degree where when BYD starts producing in Hungary, it makes me smile every time, because once BYD starts to realize just how difficult it is to actually produce and do anything in Europe relative to China, it's making me smile in terms of their realization. But so the locals basically now have 70% of the market. Why? Because the Chinese grabbed on what has been the biggest opportunity in the car market forever, which is the introduction of NEVs. Okay? And I think the single answer to your question is that, instead of a dogmatic regulation on the CO2 side, they used it as the most enormous industrial policy opportunity and set industrial policy even 10 years ago already, with regard to basically dominating that new market on the understanding that we would be slow, the West would be slow to do that, and very obviously we have been. Right, and so 3 or 4 reasons why and where they've been super strong. Firstly, geopolitics have changed completely. right? Selling German cars, German brands in the Chinese consumer market is different from what it used to be. Partly the geopolitics have changed, partly the local choice has completely changed. The choice that the Chinese car industry has given people has changed completely. Secondly, as I say, industrial policy, and we can go on about industrial policy forever, but like I say, it's really an industrial policy opportunity. And just an interesting anecdote, Europe did a study of the subsidies that the Chinese industry was getting. It's like a 200-page report, it's pretty dull. 30 pages of the report essentially is a listing of all of the different policy supports a car company can get in China. It's almost the perfect blueprint for an industrial policy. And how many of those things have we adopted in Europe, right? None, of course. It's too difficult and it's not right. Yeah, but the reality, obviously, incredibly successful. So really, really different, and I think incredibly successful. Obviously, that's resulted in huge economies of scale. Right, globally, nearly 75-80% of all NEVs, so that's BEVs and PHEVs, are sold in China. They control 80% of the world market. So we think about grand bargain. There is no grand bargain. They control the world. The battery world is even greater than 75%. Certainly in LFP batteries, it's 80 or 90%. Right. So the reality is we are already dependent on them, and the fact is we're not going to catch that up. Okay. And then lastly, the change as we move from ICE cars, and by the way, really interesting, who dominates ICE cars in China? Really interesting. Volkswagen still has 22% market share in ICE in China. Yeah, so the Chinese didn't overtake us in ICE, 100-year-old technology. They overtook us in the new technologies because they knew what they were doing and they understood, and they created that market, right? And so they basically have become better in batteries, they're better in the battery drive systems, they're better in electric motors and integrated with inverters, converters, they're better at the digital systems. They were better on all levels, and especially during COVID when we were all sat at home because we were told to be at home, suddenly the world had changed. And that world is now a completely different world. So why do I support tariffs? Well, obviously in a free world, it would be wonderful, but just to quote, and I won't tell you exactly who told me this, but a Chinese OEM told me, we need to be very careful in Europe also, because if we're too successful, we won't have a European market because nobody will have a job. So even the Chinese, right, they're much longer thinking than we are. They understand this already. And one of the ways that we can maybe lengthen the annuity value of the industry in Europe is with tariffs. And actually the BEV tariffs in Europe have been incredibly successful. Unfortunately, the Chinese have been equally successful in moving very quickly to a PHEV strategy. And so now their success is actually in PHEV rather than BEV. But some quick thoughts, but in the automotive industry, it's an interesting question.
Okay, thank you for that. So drilling down into the industry and sort of seeing the incredible leapfrogging that China has made, especially during COVID, and that it really surprised the world. I want to actually pull out a little bit at this point. And Ted, we just heard the challenges that the European countries, different sectors are facing, especially in the auto industry. But as you mentioned, the challenge is also coming from the US side. And so there is the tariff war, increasing tariffs from the US side on our European friends, and then overcapacity flooding the European market. How would you advise the EU to navigate these two challenges of its two biggest trading partners?
Well, again, as I said in answer to the first question, with some humility as the American coming from Washington to lecture on the things that we're getting wrong there. One thing I would say is just, obviously this is an event about China, and so not a surprise we're focused our discussion here. EU foreign direct investment into the United States is about 10 times foreign direct investment into China. So exposure to the US economy, hugely important. The trade relationship between the US and the EU, including services trade, is about 2x the trade with China. So, hugely important relationship. I will freely concede that we are not presenting ourselves as a friendly trading partner in the current environment. So there's a change in policy that's needed in Washington to take full advantage of the opportunity that investment and the opportunity that trade creates. But I do think it's important that recognition in Brussels of how large a trading bloc the US and EU is together, and obviously also need a recognition in Washington of that and the opportunity that it creates. I do think, and when we were talking or emailing about this panel beforehand, there will be a need given, as the U.S. market closes, as more exports come into China, for, in my view, sort of bolder and more creative use of trade tools to deal with that, to not have European industry sort of hollowed out in this time, and that's going to require bold policy. Probably it's going to require some creative policy, and it will probably require going to some uncomfortable places in a continent which is still very committed to approaching the WTO and an approach to a trading system, which candidly, between Chinese overcapacity and policy from Washington, is not really the way global trade is operating now. And so Europe will need to sort of sort through what its approach there is. The last point I would make, and I say this again with humility, coming in the U.S., it's in vogue in the United States to blame the rest of the world for our problems and not focus on the things we need to do domestically, either in our political institutions or in our economic policy. I think really, though, that the same is true in China, the same is true in the United States. And so what Europe does internally to reinvigorate competitiveness, what Europe does internally to make sure that its companies are more innovative and compete across the continent, will likely be much more determinative of the future of European industry than how it calibrates its relationship with China. And I say that from the starting point that I think that's as true in America and much under-recognized in Washington now. But pause there.
Great. I also moderate this with a great deal of humility coming from the U.S., but I think, Ted, I like what you said in terms of Europe being able to boost up its competitiveness and having a strategy and a vision for how to do that. So I want to turn to that. Yuan Ding, in terms of the MNCs, it's confronting within China slowing economic growth, regulatory barriers, and increasing competitiveness, as all of us have heard just now. So what are some of the strategies and tactics that it's using to not only survive, but actually pave the way forward for its future?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Recent years, I have been doing a couple of case studies and some consulting works with MNCs. What I observe, you have to put them into two different big baskets. One is, of course, B2B, another one is B2C. If you look at the B2C side, clearly you have to make a clear cut, which means that or you stay or you leave. If you want to stay, you have to double down your presence. So what we see, some companies, they decided to leave. And just last week, officially Starbucks announced that they are selling their Chinese business, and some Chinese PE funds are interested. And one of the buyers was in my office last week, and we had a chat, and they are officially in the process to the due diligence to close the deal. And that's one way. So you heard also some banks, some B2C, they are leaving China. And for those who want to stay, they have to fight with the highly advanced localization strategy. So we talk a lot about localization. The first thing we think about, it was the talent localization, the market, the manufacturing localization, and right before COVID, when Sergio was still there, we talk a lot about R&D localization. But nowadays, we talk more and more legal and financial localization. So there are two great examples. One is Yum, the Kentucky Fried Chicken. What they did is that they did a spin-off, but still it's controlled by US, but they listed their Great China business in Hong Kong, which was followed by Budweiser, the beer company. They also had their Asia-Pacific business, mainly in China, of course, listed in Hong Kong. So they try to not only show that their commitment to the local community, but also bring in some corner investors from the local players in order to help them change or improve their local image, but also do some dirty works for them if necessary as their investors. So there are a whole bunch of image change for this B2C business. For the B2B business, I see more double down approaches. Like the Germans start to build more larger basis of production site in China in order to become cost competitive, both for the auto industry, for the chemical industry. And for one company I work as a consultant, which is a Dutch and a Swiss company, and they are doing something very unique. That's why it's so unique. I wrote a case and I'm teaching the case in my class, is that they are doing the B2B business, and they used to serve all the major players of consumer goods, both in beverage, food, but also in cosmetics, because they are in the, the fragrant and food additive business. As you can imagine, their traditional clients should be Nestle, Danone, and Unilever, or also P&G, all of them. But they are all losing market in China. Now they represent merely a third of the market in China. And all the bigger players are actually the Chinese companies. So they realize that they don't have the speed, and their decision chain is too slow, too long. So they couldn't cope with the Chinese. When the Chinese team present an offer, a request from Ganzi Forest, nobody hear about Ganzi Forest. Now they're bigger than Coca-Cola in China, but just in 3 years, right? So in order to cope with these Chinese players, the Chinese B partners, they acquired a Chinese player in the same industry, and that's very new, because I'm doing a lot of research on merger and acquisition. In the older days, when multinational acquire a Chinese company, they apply what we call the GE model, and try to send the team and try to make the Chinese company as quickly as possible into one of their subsidiaries. But in that particular case, they try to maintain the DNA of this Chinese company in order to better serve the Chinese business. So there's some new development happening. Of course, there are some other ways, like downplaying Dutch identity, overplaying Swiss identity. So there are a lot of things doing in China in order to survive and to better compete.
That was a great fine-grained analysis of the different strategies that these different firms or MNCs are taking, so thank you for that. So Harald, next to you, you started to touch on why tariffs is a good idea. It gives European auto firms breathing room and to catch up. But are there other strategies that you can think of to, improve the competitiveness of European auto sector and what it might do?
Yeah, again, great question, and I love some of the comments that some of the other speakers were making already. This is not about punishing China. As I highlighted, China was smarter than us. It was very simple. But the reality also is that the Chinese industry, was already oversupplied in the ICE industry. The ICE industry was 26 million. They probably had capacity for over 30 million cars. The ICE industry now in China is 13 million. Right? So we've got 17 million units of overcapacity of ICE in a global automotive market of 82 million or 85 million cars. Okay? Then they've built an NEV industry on top of the ICE industry of another 30 million units, or certainly between 20 and 30 million units. Right? And so the reality is that they have a different view of the world in terms of return on capital, in terms of profitability. It's a political-based system and job creation system where we simply cannot compete with that capacity. Right? And just to give you a quote here, which I was mentioning earlier, but maybe so it should will make us all think a little bit. I was with the CEO of Volkswagen and Porsche recently, and he was proudly explaining how he's just reached an agreement to close 40% of Volkswagen German capacity. Right? So this is what tariffs are all about. You can't save an industry that's been closed. We need to save it first, and then maybe at some stage we can try to be competitive. Okay? And so really, really important point. So the thing about the tariffs is, at least in the short term, to offset the advantages that the Chinese have built, which I was highlighting earlier already. The obvious way to do that is basically go back to what the Chinese have done. I've just told you, right? Our own study shows you what their industrial policy was. Well, why don't we have an industrial policy that actually helps the industry? Right? So, I can go through that whole list, but the obvious things are, one, we have had 27 different country subsidy schemes. How do you run a car company where you've got 27 different sets of subsidies that you have to run to? Every single model, you have to have the 27 different variants just to tax maximize those models. It's wonderful. It's impossible to do business, right? So an obvious one there. So again, we need a pan-European model. Secondly, on the taxes, same thing on the taxes. Secondly, prioritize industry and employment. Let's not be dogmatic about this. We need jobs. Without jobs, there's no point regulating everybody because there's no jobs in industry to regulate, right? And so, the most obvious thing, and just again, as a number to give you, this is exactly what the CEO was telling me, right? Just to assemble a car in Germany is 4,000 euros. In China, it's about 1,000. But Eastern Europe, it's about 1,500. Yeah? And so the reality is we need to think about employment costs. We need to think about all the regulations related to employment costs. We need to think about energy cost. Right? He smiles when he looks at Chinese energy cost. Right? Energy costs in China are about 3 or 4% of what they are in Germany. Right? I mean, why would you produce in Germany? But these are worrying numbers we need to think about, right? So, and then lastly, what my colleague here was talking about, the localization, really, really interesting. And this is, again, talks to the grand bargain. Grand bargains, political stuff. We're in the grand bargain. It's one world. It's one automotive industry. That's not going to change. Right? And so the reality is, again, actually kind of exciting what Volkswagen has been doing. Volkswagen has completely divorced the Chinese business from Germany. Has never happened before. So all product decisions, all technology decisions have always been made in Wolfsburg, which, frankly, for a Chinese dynamic market was not very smart. That's now fully localized, right? And we're using Xiaopeng technology. They've bought a stake in Xiaopeng. We're using Horizon Robotics for ADAS. They've developed an ADAS, level 2++ ADAS system, which drove me all around Shanghai, completely unaided for 45 minutes. They built that system in 6 months. Some Western companies have been trying to do it for 10 years and they still can't do it, right? And so Volkswagen is building this company in China, and it is super dynamic. They've reduced the cost by 50% in terms of developing the car. The actual manufacturing costs are down by 50%, and they've reduced the development time from 5 years to 2 years. The grand bargain is we're going to use everything we've learned in China and do the same thing in Europe, right? How long before we produce those Chinese cars in Wolfsburg, right? But we are going to use the supply chains. We're going to use the batteries and everything else from China. So lots and lots and lots we can do, lots and things we are already doing, but we need to save the industry to be saved first before we can become competitive, would be my answer.
Great, thank you, Harald. We heard a lot about sort of China's incredible competitiveness and actually maybe overflooding the auto industry in Europe and whatnot. But I want to remind us and come to Alicia, you, and also kind of, pull out a little bit for the macro picture, which is that Europe is actually the second largest trading partner for China. Do you think in the upcoming EU-China summit, China is actually aware of this interdependence, their dependence on the European market? And then secondly, what do you think the leaders of the EU are trying to accomplish? What would be success in your eyes in terms of how the summit, the outcome from the summit?
Well, if you consider ASEAN a bloc, yes, we're the second, but I don't think ASEAN is a bloc, so we're the first. We're the first market for China. And we've been for a while, and this is related to the US de-risking, reducing, although, if you counted all of the exports that go through Vietnam, maybe you would still be the first. But with the numbers we have, we're the first market. So do we have leverage? And Finbar is there. I think he's heard the story before. If you go to Brussels, they will tell you we have a lot of leverage because we have the largest market. But that's not enough. That's not enough to have leverage. Because for that to be true, you need to be able to put that market there and take it back. Yeah? That's leverage. That's export controls on rare earths from China. There's your rare earths, I take them back. Can we do that with our market? With 18% tariffs only on one good electric vehicles? No. Our market is open, so there's no leverage. Now, should we close it? Maybe not. But at least there should be a credible threat. We don't have a credible threat. The only thing we have, other than those small tariffs, is export controls on ASML. Is that enough? Of course not, because as was pointed out before, and I actually did some research on this, every single company in the US entity list, for that matter, in your entity list for export controls, actually increased R&D dramatically in China. So my point is, our leverage is only leverage if we can really take it away and China does not react. That's the second thing. Because if China overreacts, then there's no leverage. How can China overreact? Pulling everything elsewhere. Yeah. So the more we, my point for this summit really is, the more we increase the interdependence without leverage, the more exposed we are. The more exposed we are. So let's get all of this greenfield investment into Spain or Hungary. And then suddenly somebody says, if I click a button, no employment. So where's our leverage? So, I think we really need to think this through, that we need to make our relation more symmetric. I believe in coexistence, in codependence, not one-side dependence, because then there's no way, let alone with 28 countries, that we can really benefit as Europeans. And this is not China's fault, don't take me wrong, this is our fault. So the summit should go and say, you know what, and I think your comment was very good, if there are no consumers in Europe, I'm sorry, maybe we cannot close our market, but if our consumers don't make anything out of this, you won't have a market. That's very convincing, isn't it? So basically we need to get to something, maybe not a grand bargain, but something where China understands that by hitting the wall, 45% industrial production in the world, that's hitting the wall. That's war. I'm not saying that, it's obvious, because there's no way that the rest of the world can suddenly deindustrialize, and this is not only Europe, this is Brazil, go to Turkey and talk to them. They're terrified. So if everybody thinks China is going to take all of the jobs away, beyond AI, that's not going to work. So I think we need a relation where everybody realizes that a lot is at stake. So we need more codependence.
Okay, so on a slightly grim note, but I think the need for mobilizing different blocs, different nations to cooperate and to figure out a long-term strategy for how to compete and outcompete China in different sectors is a message that I think we got at the end. So I know we don't have a lot of time, and I want to turn to this very knowledgeable audience to take some questions. Over there.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm Xiaofei Xu from South China Morning Post, based here in Paris. I think we can all agree that China needs to participate in the reindustrialization of Europe. Chinese investment in Europe needs to create jobs. But I think the difference between, say, what the US did with the Marshall Plan or what Japan did in the 90s, the 80s, to a lesser extent, is that China, on the political side, is a rival of Europe. It doesn't have the democratic value or whatever. So how far do we think that could go until someone jumps out and be like, this is a national security risk? Because the example, since we're in Paris, the example would be Macron's great dream of turning France into a EV battery powerhouse could not be realized without Chinese brand. And I'm just waiting for when 2027 hits, there's a presidential election, someone is going to jump up and be like, well, this is not how you do it, because now we're dependent on China, and then they could, like Alicia was saying, they could put the button and then it will be the end of us. So how do you think Europe can, or like Europe and China can, I guess, work on that dynamic, given this particularity with China, that it is on the political side, something that's not compatible with Europe?
Alicia, would you like to take that?
I'll be very brief, because I'm sure there's many questions. If you want to build it, so we have different political systems. I don't know which one is better. We can have different views, but maybe I know. But the point is, it's my view, and you have a different view, everybody, fine. But what I know is that you don't push buttons unless really needed. Because if you do, you undermine trust. Why? And this is, I'm sure we've pushed many, but I'm focusing on we're heading to a summit, yeah? 3 buttons. First, export controls. I thought they were for the US. No, they were for us. Like, excuse me. I thought we were trying to negotiate a great bargain. One stick. Where are the carrots? Second stick, cognac. Everybody knows here. Third stick, medical devices, as you know. Three in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Why? Because that, you know, the thing is, how can I convince anybody that there's no national security, economic security, you name it, independent on China if I basically get this before I go to Beijing? So I think the political difference is also into the trade-off between sticks and carrots. I think China's trade-off between sticks and carrots is that if you're strong, I give you carrots. If you're weak, Europe, you know, 28 members, I give you sticks. That doesn't work. That's the point I'm trying to make, because eventually you won't have any trust. So those, you know, hawks saying, oh, national security, economic security, we'll have all of the examples needed for that summit not to be successful. So what I'm trying to say here is, you call it charm offensive, real one, not you know, and really be more on the give than on the take, because if not, you're already on the take. You're already on the take. Why take? Never give. That it doesn't work, even with 28 countries. So that's my advice for, you know, for this national security not to dominate the discussion.
So, if I could take maybe one more question. There was a gentleman who was over there who had raised his hand. So, no? Okay. Anybody else? Right over here. And if you could keep your question short and the response short, that would be great.
Definitely. Okay, thanks. I was wondering, you mentioned export controls being part of the EU-China summit on the table, for example, ASML. Do you really think the EU can take a decision like that when it's mainly a sovereign opportunity for the Dutch government? What's your take on that?
Yeah, to be honest, actually, I don't mind. Look, think about the car industry. So first answer is, I mean, the geopolitics, the split has already happened, right? So the erosion of trust has already happened. That was one of the things I said, and clearly the win of the locals in the local industry in China is part of that, right? So, you know, that's already happened. The second point is, do tariffs, really, really work, right? And so if you think about ASML, or if you think about semiconductors, right, what are the Chinese going to do? Well, they're going to speed up production and the innovation in that industry by themselves. And so all that we will achieve eventually by doing this is to reduce the advantages that we currently have in those technologies. And in the automotive sector, it's already really obvious, right? And the Chinese are doing the same and making the same mistake, frankly, right? The role rare earth, we had manganese, where they restricted manganese to the Western world about 3 years ago. Recently, rare earths. Right? And all they're doing is highlighting the strategic problem of having 90% of the world refining of these products in the Chinese market. And so however difficult, and it is difficult to do these things, and horrible pollution and all of these things, but the West has finally realized that we have no choice. We are already incredibly dependent on China, right? And the more that China points that out, frankly, right, the more likely we are actually going to be able to make some of these decisions. Holland versus the EU, you know yourself how difficult that is. Just a quick anecdote, again, I'm really sorry, but tariffs. Talking to the same CEO, trying to get some sort of tariff relief with the Americans, and the auto deal is basically being pushed into an EU deal. The CEO was not incredibly optimistic how easy that process was going to be. So, it's the same old within the EU, single countries. Unfortunately, to be honest, the answer in the EU is the single countries eventually are going to have to think the same, right? Some people are going to have to compromise, as many have done in the past, right?
Great. So I'm being ushered off the platform, and what a great panel this was. There's so many things to go into, but thank you very much.